On April 16, Boeing said it plans to deliver 26 satellites in 2026, up from 11 in 2025, as it expands production with Millennium Space Systems and rolls out a new mid-class platform called Resolute. That sounds like dry factory news. It is not. It is a sign that space power is shifting from prestige programs toward repeatable industrial output, because military customers now want systems that can be built faster, fielded faster, replaced faster, and adapted faster. For years, a lot of people treated space as a theater of masterpieces. Build a few exquisite satellites, take forever, spend a fortune, and pray nothing goes wrong. That model made sense when space was calmer, when orbital infrastructure was thinner, and when the main concern was getting a small number of very capable systems into place. Today, the environment is rougher. Space forces want proliferated constellations, quicker refresh cycles, more maneuver, more resilience, and less dependence on a handful of orbital crown jewels that can become giant, glowing targets. The age of cathedral spacecraft is giving way, at least in part, to the age of the Arsenal line. That is why Boeing's announcement matters. The company is not merely saying, "Look, we built a new satellite bus." It is saying something more interesting. It is saying it wants higher throughput, more common products, and repeatable manufacturing across Boeing and Millennium. In plain English, it wants to turn satellite production into something less bespoke and more scalable. That may not stir the soul the way moonshots do, but strategy often hides in places with bad coffee and fluorescent lighting. The new platform, Resolute, sits in a useful middle ground. Boeing says it is meant for missions that need more capability than a traditional small satellite can provide, while offering greater speed and flexibility than a typical large satellite program. That middle ground matters because many defense missions do not fit neatly into the old categories. Some need more power, more payload margin, or more staying power than a very small spacecraft can offer. Yet they do not need the years of delay and engineering sprawl that often come with large, exquisite platforms. Resolute is Boeing's answer to that awkward middle child of the market. The company is also making a production argument. Boeing says the 2026 target is being supported by investments in common products, repeatable manufacturing approaches, and tighter integration across Boeing and Millennium lines. That phrasing matters. Commonality lowers non-recurring engineering. Repeatable processes lower delay risk. Shared components make scaling easier. This is the dull machinery behind military readiness. Armies do not run on adjectives. They run on delivery schedules. Air and Space Forces magazine put the geopolitical context into sharper focus. On the same day Boeing rolled this out, reporting from Space Symposium described a Pentagon push for more production and speed, with officials stressing the need for flexible, agile lines that can scale quickly. Air Force Secretary Troy Mike said the service needs industry to ramp deliveries and do so on schedule. Lieutenant General Philip Garrett went even further, saying that if a company is making 10, the government wants it ready to make 40. That is not a peacetime hobby note. That is a procurement system trying to prepare industry for a harsher world. Now step back and look at the wider pattern. Modern military space is moving toward constellations, redundancy, mobility, and refresh. If you expect satellites to be jammed, dazzled, hacked, tracked, shadowed, or in some cases physically threatened, then the answer cannot be to nurse one exquisite platform like a royal infant and hope the enemy behaves himself. You need depth. You need replenishment. You need options. You need buses and payloads that can be turned into actual spacecraft on timelines short enough to matter. In contested orbit, industrial tempo becomes a military attribute. This is where people often miss the point. They hear manufacturing scale and think of commercial business chatter. Yet in defense space, production capacity is part of deterrence. A country that can replace losses, expand constellations, and field new orbital capabilities faster sends a message. It tells rivals that attacking one bird may not buy much. It tells allies that support can be sustained. It tells procurement offices that their plans have some chance of surviving contact with reality, which is already more than many PowerPoint decks deserve. Boeing's position here is interesting because it reflects a larger industrial blend now favored across defense. Boeing brings heritage, payload expertise and relationships with major national security programs. Millennium brings a faster, smaller satellite production culture. Boeing itself described the strategy as combining mission heritage and payload expertise with Millennium's rapid production approach and common products. That pairing matters because the Pentagon does not want speed alone. It wants speed without chaos. It wants agility without amateur hour. Space competition is no longer about who can fling a symbolic object into orbit for headlines. It is about who can build a durable orbital order under pressure. China understands this. The United States understands it unevenly, which is a polite way of saying that Washington usually figures things out after the bill arrives. Commercial constellations, responsive launch, on-orbit maneuver, missile warning, targeting support, and resilient communications all depend on an industrial base that can produce spacecraft in numbers and on time. When Boeing talks about throughput, common architecture, and backlog execution, it is speaking the quiet language of great power competition. There is also a budget signal here. Air and Space Forces magazine reported that the Space Force's budget request jumped sharply and included a major procurement increase. Officials tied that increase to plans for new contracts and bigger production awards. Whether every dollar survives the political meat grinder is another matter. Still, the direction is clear. The service wants industry to invest in facilities and capacity now so it can absorb larger orders later. In other words, the government is trying to pull the industrial base forward before the crisis rather than during it. That is wise. It is also unusual enough to count as a small miracle of bureaucracy. Notice also what Boeing did not say. It did not frame this as a one-off breakthrough machine that changes everything overnight. It framed it as deeper production, common architecture, and a broader mix of mission-ready options. That is a more mature vision. Real military advantage often comes from dependable systems of production, rather than glamorous one-time leaps. Boeing says Resolute is meant to support communications, sensing, and other mission needs across different orbital paths. That suggests a platform intended for varied roles rather than a single narrow niche. In strategic terms, flexible buses matter because governments want optionality. The future fight in space is unlikely to reward rigid architectures. It will reward systems that can be adapted across missions and folded into changing constellations without a doctoral dissertation in re-engineering every time a requirement shifts. The side that learns to standardize wisely often gains a hidden advantage. Standardization sounds boring, because it is boring. It is also wonderful. Common avionics, common interfaces, common manufacturing steps, common product lines. These things shrink lead times, ease training, simplify maintenance, and reduce the number of ways a schedule can die in a conference room. If contested orbit becomes a long game rather than a brief spasm, standardization will look less like administrative housekeeping and more like strategic prudence. Now, does this mean Boeing has solved the military space production problem? No. Announcements are cheap. Delivery is the test. Boeing says 26 satellites in 2026. That is the claim to watch. If it hits that number, and if the company can show that common products and integrated production actually shorten timelines without sacrificing mission assurance, then this story gets much larger. If the number slips, then we file it under the ancient aerospace tradition of optimism colliding with reality at high speed. Still, even with that caution, the strategic point stands. Industrial capacity in space is no longer a back-office concern. It is part of military competition itself. The satellites that carry communications, missile warning, sensing, and targeting support do not appear by patriotic feeling. They come from supply chains, production lines, trained labor, tested components, and factories that can keep moving when demand spikes. Every serious military buildup eventually becomes a story about production. Space is now old enough and dangerous enough to follow the same rule. That is why this Boeing story deserves more attention than it will get. People love launch footage. They love glossy renderings. They love the theater of hardware rising on a pillar of fire. Fine. Rockets are dramatic. Factories are where nations decide whether the drama can continue. A satellite fleet is only as credible as the industrial base behind it. If the United States wants resilient space power, it needs more than clever designs and ambitious doctrines. It needs the ability to produce orbital capability at a pace that matches the threat environment. So the real headline is not that Boeing wants to go from 11 deliveries to 26. The real headline is that military space is entering a phase in which production rate has become a strategic fact. We are watching space power become industrial power in a more visible form. The glamorous age of rare orbital jewels is giving way to an age of replenishable constellations, adaptable buses, and manufacturing depth. That is less romantic. It is also far more serious. Factories are strategy with fluorescent lighting.